Hello everyone, thank you for joining this March TAM customer webinar. Before we get into today's content, I'd just like to point out a couple of things. Our next TAM customer webinar is going to be on the 9th of April with guest speaker EUC legend Brian Madden, explaining how VMware solutions can empower your remote workforce. And if you do have any questions during today's webinar, please use the Q&A feature of Zoom and we'll try and address them during the webinar. The webinar will be recorded and your TAM can help make the recording available to you after the call. So for today's session, we're going to be discussing operationalizing HCI, how to ensure long-term customer success with vSAN-powered HCI solutions, be that native vSAN, VxRail or VCF. We're going to discuss what's required to be successful and to successfully operate this solution with experience drawn from the field, from yourselves, our customers, highlighting theory, processes and gotchas to help you prepare and operate your production HCI environments. So I'd like to welcome VMware Staff Architect of Customer Engagement, Paul McSharry. His focus area is vSAN and HCI, where he's a subject matter expert, and likely you'll have seen his videos in the VMware Learning Zone or perhaps at VMworld or even on site with your TAM. So Paul is a VMware certified design expert, a VCDX and a certified VMware instructor. He's also an active blogger at elasticsky.co.uk. We'll post the link into the chat in a moment. And he's also a published author and he's been a vExpert since 2012. He's a keen martial artist and he's also a tortoise owner. If you follow him on Twitter, you'll see these things. And he's got a particular interest in combining architectural work and education to help customers operationalize solutions. So we're very happy to have you here today, Paul. Thank you for your time. And with that said, I'll hand over to Paul for today's session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. Hi, everyone. I didn't recognize that person on the introduction, but very well done. Thank you. And Noel says hi to everyone. So yeah, Noel's my tortoise. I'm a big follower of the VMware Turtles, and I'm a big Oasis fan as well. So I combine them both, and I've got a tortoise called Noel. So enough of the little tidbits about me. This is the session we're going to talk about for about an hour, I guess, or so. I like to make it interactive as much as possible. These things can be. So please feel free to put questions in the Q&A and I will try and incorporate them as I go along. And this is operationalizing hyper-converged infrastructure. And so I'm Paul McSharry, I'm a staff architect. I've been working at VMware for about 18 months as a full-time employee, but I was consulting and a VCI teaching for VMware for about 8 or 9 years. And in the field, I've been a consultant. I've also been the person inside the company where PSO have done a great job and deployed VMware solutions. And then they leave, and I'm sitting there with someone who is also working with me going, now what do I do? I've got to run this thing. I've got to make it look like whatever company I'm working at, and I've got to make it work without deleting stuff. And while I'm at VMware 18 months, I've been using that kind of experience in my full-time job around vSAN, VVD, VCF, and anything HCI. So that's really what this next hour or so is about. I'm a bit of a blogger. So again, everything that I mention on my slide deck will be expanded on my blog. There's lots of mind maps and there's lots of deep dive links from VMworld videos from my colleagues that I recommend. So the agenda, we're going to give a quick chat about what the Advanced Customer Engagement team is. So everyone on here is either linked by a TAM. So we are available via your TAM to help. So if anything on here you like or you think could be important to you, just leave it a quick chat. We are here to help you and support you. I'm going to go through what I call enterprise technical comfort is, the importance of operationalizing and why it's often missed. We're going to go through some of the field things that I come across, the gotchas that I've seen currently in the market, and answer 2 key questions. Number 1, what does the HCI administrator actually do? Because haven't we been running vSphere for years? And what is the minimum to support HCI in production? And then towards the end, I'll give you a whole heap of links that you can do follow-up information on afterwards. So the Advanced Customer Engagement team, we're part of the new Customer Experience organization. So we work alongside TAMs, we look alongside PSO, and we work alongside GSS. So we're here to basically help increase consumption of the product. So you actually buy the product. We don't want it to become shelfware. We want to actually increase consumption for you. We want to assist you and help the account team. So for the account team, they own the relationship, and I'm here as part of the team of the Advanced Customer Engagement team, or they call it ACE, to actually try and help along. We've got expertise across the whole board. So I do the HCI, there are people that do automation, there are people that do containers, you know, anything emerging, we all tend to cross-train, but we have specialized areas as well. And we tend to provide technical advisory, design decisions, operational processes, and this presentation is around the operationalizing workshop type scenarios that I work in. So they can be one-to-one or one-to-many, and they generally last a full day. So we've got quite a lot to talk through in an hour, but that gives you an idea of this is a whole day experience if you do it with your TAM on a specific project. So how do we help? We provide POC assistance, we look at design architecture, we follow up with the business unit, we make sure you're operationally ready. That's the bit that I find very interesting, taking a design and then actually making it work through to production so the operational team can actually use it. That's the bit that I think, have I done a good job? Number 7 works. You know, the interesting bit is the design, but the actual bit that makes the money is number 7 towards the end. So over the past year, I've been working with pretty much the largest HCI, vSAN and VCF customers that we have, and I get 2 key messages. The first one is we have bought in to the idea that we want to work like a cloud, but we're not all like hyperscalers. We're not all like AWS, but we want to work in that kind of approach. I agree. Then we have this predictable infrastructure. We want to think about apps, but we still have predictable infrastructure to talk about. So as long as it's predictable and consistent, we're good. And then the second piece is I want to be happy to put my enterprise data on VCF, HCI, but ultimately on vSAN. So how do I feel comfortable putting my production enterprise data on vSAN from an operational perspective? And what do I get from things like VxRail and VCF? And why should I bother? Those kinds of things. And if someone's bought into it, how do I run it? So I kind of talk about the life of a HCI admin. And people spend a lot of time on the design, and the install area should be quite click, 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 click. And there could be different teams. So we'll talk about everything is coming from the bottom, from the right-hand side of here, where people are saying, I've been given this thing. How do I validate it's ready for production? How do I know it's safe to make a change? How do I know the designer didn't miss something? How did I know the partner didn't miss something? How did I know PSO have been missed a couple of buttons? How do I validate it? Those kinds of things. And then make sure that everyone else can actually think, we know what we're watching, we know how to do our first upgrade, and we know how to monitor it. Yeah. So we talk about those kinds of things in that process. One of the things that I have noticed in the field is people use HCI, vSAN, and VVD, and VCF randomly. And you can be sitting in the meeting and go, I'm not quite sure what he means or she means by HCI, because it means something different to that person. So from a traditional point of view, I'm going to go to my whiteboard. From a traditional point of view, on the design side of things, you have management, virtual machine, compute, network, and storage. So bear with me a second. You got management, virtual machine, compute, network, and storage. Now, management is anything to do with the management tier. So vCenter, VOps, NSX Manager, SDDC Manager for VCF, VxRail Manager for VxRail, those kinds of things. Virtual machine, any of the virtual machine workloads, computers like ESXi hosts, network, DV, switch, and storage being some sort of storage that we can store our VMs on. With HCI, we're converging them. We're actually doing some sort of convergence. And strictly speaking, Hyperconvergence is taking a single box or multiple boxes for capacity and converging these into a single stack. And that's all well and good, but depending on which vendor, depending on which approach, it could be just this piece together, or it could be the whole lot. So it depends on the architecture and the structure of what HCI means. Basic HCI, from a VMware perspective, is vCenter, vSphere, vSAN, and some network, not necessarily NSX, just a network. And then some monitoring that comes with it, which is VOps in a specific edition. So you have vSAN with the operationalizing dashboards. The vSAN itself, software-defined storage, that's the actual product. So that's quite self-explanatory. VVD, something different. VVD is VMware's validated designs, which you can download. They are free. They are a way of working. They're not just a reference architecture. They're filled with utilities. They're filled with an approach for optimization. They're filled with upgrade plans and all those things. So they're a way of working. And the way I say VVD is it makes sense of the software-defined data center. It allows someone who doesn't necessarily do VMware every day, because you guys will be doing all sorts of things. It takes that and then changes it slightly to say, this is how we think you should run it. And the thing that sets VVD apart from everything else is that VVD is actually tested and built inside VMware and actually built and tested for a certain number of VMs. Very similar to like you have when you say, I'm going to build something for a business requirement. And then VCF, VMware Cloud Foundation, is now very, very hot. It's our direction towards modern apps as well. But VCF is the automated deployment and operationalization solution for VVD. So we're deploying VVD and we're using a product to do it. But we're changing some of the operational processes. It is a product in itself. So VVD is a way of working, VCF is a product, vSAN is a product, and HCI is a concept, is the way I think of it. Okay, so from a design operational point of view, the data center model is changing. I see quite regularly, I think even yesterday I saw that in the next 3 to 4 years, everything is basically HCI. Companies are now buying HCI, or they're going to the cloud, or they're doing a mixture of both. And that's how we're converging these traditional silos from storage, network, and everything else. And we're adding in automation to make some sort of standard. But how does a vSphere admin go from, I know vSphere, to I want to know VCF? Now that's a question. So when I worked as a contractor, the last 2 contracts before I was lucky enough to join VMware, they were all VCF questions. I had no questions on vSphere. So that was 2 years, that was nearly 2 years ago. So nowadays, a lot of the partners, a lot of the companies, the customers, I will be buying VCF. So from a personal point of view, to maintain relevancy, it is normally more towards VCF. But you still need, I'm not saying you don't need to understand everything else underneath. It's something else to understand. But you need to have enough information and enough skill set around the traditional silos to hold a conversation to meet the standard. And we'll talk about that a bit further on. So I'm a VCDX, I'm an architect. I follow the Zachman process, which is you take conceptual, logical, physical. Conceptual is what the business wants to do. So I want to have 2 data centers. I want to host production applications that are secure and have a disaster recovery process for, I don't know, 5 minutes and get it and have 0 data loss. That's my design concept. The logical design is now you and me, we get in the room together. We say, well, prod can't talk to dev. Dev can't talk to prod, and we make some sort of logical decisions where we'll do active, 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 passive, and it could be any vendor that could do it. And then the physical design is what the vendor like VMware would do to create and finish this concept that you were looking to. And what we need to do, that's when the person might leave. That may be, depending on your company, the bit that you fill in, or it could be the bit that I used to fill in. This is a bit what I used to do as my role. And if you think to consider about going through a new solution as a designer, you go through all these different considerations. So you've got design decisions for each one. If you're going to do your VCDX, you're going to write design decisions for each one of these. You're going to write pages and pages of documentation. And then this time is design. That can take a lot of time. And once you've done 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, 10, 20, they all look similar. They have go-to designs, but there'll be slight variances. So there'll be some consistency and there'll be some variances. What we want to do is trying to reduce the time. So ideally, when we get to the point where I want some infrastructure in AWS, I want some infrastructure on my on-premises cloud, I want my infrastructure somewhere else, I move my apps. So I don't really care. So ultimately, as a VPC, I send an API call. At the end of this presentation, when it's all configured correctly, we can do the same thing with VMware by sending an API call for a new workload domain via the SDDC Manager if we've got some host commissioned. That is the operational difference. We can get vSphere that takes a certain amount of time to do, but get it consistent, operationally consistent, infrastructure consistent as quick as we need to. And that's the end goal, but it's a journey. And how do we get there? So for each design decision on here, we have an impact. So for an example, in vSAN, if we turn compression and dedupe on, it changes the operational procedure. That means if I lose either type of disk, I have to replace the disk group, but I get added value because I get some compression and dedupe. And it depends on the workload. But we need to know what these decisions are for VCF and VVD and vSAN. And then we can judge what are the risks here. And then we can do some sort of monitoring. We can automate a task. We can back it up in a certain way. We can make changes at certain times of day. We can change our design slightly to make sure it meets our requirements. Yeah, so that's why we do it. So one key question, does it remove it? Does design get removed if you use VVD or VCF and so on? And for my idea, for my area, I'd say no. The process is still the same. However, we still have to consider the process and consider what we're going to have at the end of it. So we're taking our traditional, we're making it hyper-converged, and we need to hold a conversation. We don't need to be a full stack engineer. I asked this at VMworld in front of 600 people and said, who's a full stack engineer? And essentially 2 people put their hand up. Now those 2 people, you can't operationalize your business on 2 people, let alone it was at VMworld. So there wasn't that many people that might say they're a full stack engineer. So what are the design decisions? What are the minimal skills you need to be able to support VCF? And we can go into that. So for each level, management, virtual machine, compute, network, and storage, we consider configuration, the initial, the actual drift and the monitoring, how to back it up in case we make a mistake, because when we're new to technology, we could make a mistake. Rollback of each component. We don't really want to rebuild everything because I made a problem on my firewall. Kind of goes against what we're doing. So backup and rollback. How do we patch? How do we keep it secure? What's the change management? Am I allowed to make a change now? Is it a good idea? And then one key thing is how to make VCF or vSAN look like your business, how to integrate with your platform. And the example outputs I say is you take the VVD as a good starting point, and then you go into validation. You say, what does my system look like compared to VVD? I don't agree with these design decisions, and you get an exception. And then you check with VCF, you check if that's a guardrail that can be changed or not. You check with VxRail that can be changed or not. And then you can meet the requirements that you're looking for. The end result is you get a list of daily checks, a list of benchmarks, and a design documentation that is quick before you have to go through the whole process that I showed on the board, where you have to go through each and every design decision. Yeah. Then you end up with things like this. So here's an example of one for NSX. I worked at a company where it was quite early on. A team of network people didn't know NSX, and a team of vSphere people didn't know NSX, and they hadn't got much skill set bleeding between each other. So I made a flow chart that actually said, is it NSX or did NSX do it? And yes, we could go through VMK ping, we could go through, show VNI, you can go through the VIBs, or you could just ping between two VMs, show the ARP cache, and then clear it, and then ping it again and see the ARP cache and see if the MAC address appears on two different hosts on the same VNI. Then L2 networking is working rather than going through all the controllers and finding it. Daily checks like that can then be automated, and you can get them sent by email, such as vcheck, sent to Slack with integrations, and just say everything's fine, everything's not fine. So you can start taking the design, getting the risk, making that risk a process, and then automating that process to validate it's working or not. So it's all systematic, and it's all a process that we can do regardless of the technology. So from the field, in this presentation, I'm going to go through what vSAN, because it's where your data lives, the importance of vSAN for HCI. We're going to talk about how a customer, I'm not just going to say, have a look at the VVD. I'm going to go through the VVD and say, how would I use it? Because when I look at it, it's 400 pages. Am I going to read it all? Maybe, maybe not. Might have enough time. So what's the key bits of VVD? And then how do you use VCF, and is it appropriate to you? Is it something you should think about? And what if someone is actually thinking about using VCF? And we'll go through a bring up, and we'll talk about after the bring up. What do you do once you've got it on site? And what are the minimum you should do? Okay, so vSAN itself, software-defined storage, runs on x86. And as my little board here, bear with me 2 seconds and then come back. Here we are. So I've got my vCenter. This is my management plane, which should be automated deployed by VCF or VxRail, depending which design choice you do. There are different options. And you've got your ESXi host, you've got compute. You got a reliable storage. So vSAN is software-defined storage, but it's also network storage. And we're combining the network and storage stack into your compute stack to make one single data store. So inside VCF, you can have a workload domain, which I'll explain a bit later on. But a workload domain can have one cluster. And if you use the right version of VCF, such as 3.5 and above, you can use multi-cluster. vSAN is a single data store per cluster. Here, I have two types of disk. These two disks, one is cache, one is capacity. And I use a storage policy-based management. So that's something that you can see straight out of the book. Now, thinking from an operational point of view, what next? So what next? I'm going to zoom in a bit. So I'm going to say, here's my VM. This is the bit that I think from an operational point of view. So my VM wants storage. Okay. And all my customer cares about is it gets their storage as quick as possible. So the average command latency from a VM to the storage is a metric that we can measure. Then we've got the VM kernel command latency. Then we've got the physical command latency. That doesn't change. That's the logic. If we put vSAN in, we've got something slightly different. We've got a different method of delivery, so a different media. That media, so this VM is going to ask for storage, and the ESXi host with the cache disk marked in yellow will go yes. Just go yes, 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 yes. There are two types of vSAN. One is hybrid, one is all flash. All flash is got a 600 gig write buffer. In hybrid, you've got 70% read, 30% write, but the 30% write can max out at 600 gig. So for every single disk group in a host, which consists of a cache and a capacity tier, you will have 600 gig maximum buffer. And as I fill that buffer up at 30% of the 600 gig, I start to cool the data. And the data leaves the cache tier and goes into the capacity tier. Now, one quick thing is if I turn this host off, the cache is persistent. No data moves, it's persistent, it's log-based, it stays there. Now this data is cooling. If I buy the right license, I can compress, I can dedupe and compress it. I have a dedupe engine. That again can have overhead, it can add CPU requirements, not overhead to the VM saying yes, but overhead from a consolidation ratio. It will take more resources. Could be negligible, it could is how you test it. So from my write buffer, what we need to do from an application point of view, the minimum you need to understand for vSAN for VCF is to know that that VM needs storage. That's what it needs. So it needs capacity, it needs availability, and it needs performance. So from a VM perspective, things such as outstanding IO, we need to make sure it's okay me drawing one VM, but if you've got 300 VMs, that VM data, which is cooling, needs to cool and be placed into the capacity tier without impacting the other VMs. So anything like outstanding IO, back pressure, percentage read of cache, if it's continuously high, we're not destaging quick enough. So things like that are key metric indicators that says the vSAN capacity or the vSAN ready node or the vSAN node you're using may be either missized, could potentially have a firmware issue, could potentially have an issue inside somewhere else, and you need to find out a way forward looking at it. And you don't have to log on to the host to do it. I'll show you some health checks. You don't have to know it to the nth degree. I'll show you some health checks and VOps checks a bit later on to do this automated. But the theory behind it is a VM is asking for storage. It goes to the right buffer and is told yes. The next piece on from there, it's only said yes to the VM when it's already been written to another host. So if you've got FTT of 1, which means 2 copies of the data, you are writing to another host. So you are going across a big line across your network. So when you put vSAN in, you're strictly hyperconverged the network and the storage because you've got network-based storage here. So you've got storage considerations. Other things to consider around HCI with vSAN is that when you buy HCI boxes and you've got existing vSphere estates, HCI boxes generally have less number of NICs. So you've got logical design and security and performance and availability things to consider, which if you use VVD or VCF, it's a lot easier to start making decisions. Okay, so that's fundamental type theory. So I'm going to draw it out on my whiteboard and go a bit deeper and just say what the common areas to think about. So my iPad is locked there for a second. So here I've got my vCenter on here, and then I've got my ESXi hosts. I have a consistent network, so things such as MTU. From a support perspective, you have consistency. So you make sure both at the DVS, the VM kernel port, marked as vSAN, and the top of rack, and any layer 3 that you have, because layer 2 and layer 3 is supported, is consistent throughout. These are the gotchas that come across. These are things that you may be existingly using vSphere for compute virtualization. Now you're putting storage in, and the top of rack switches are not really aimed for that. So those kinds of conversations to ask your network team, MTU from one site to the other site. So really what I want to know is I have a VM here. I have 2 types of disk, cache, 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 and then capacity. So as my capacity is filling up, I have replica, replica, witness. So this is the data, this is my logical object, this replica data that I'm using. I'm writing to here, but I'm also reading across here, writing to the cache here before I acknowledge back. So this network, if it's local, if it's across 2 sites using stretch cluster, it is the rate determining step. So a reliable MTU, a reliable transit network, and a reliable latency is required all the way through, and understanding it. There are daily checks, well, there are 15-minute checks in the automatic checks inside vSAN that will show you those kinds of things that we're talking about. But from a minimum perspective, to help troubleshooting, I would want the VM kernel MAC address and IP address of every single ESXi host and be able to draw the path for my RDT, which is the transport protocol for vSAN, to say I know how to get there, and then know each hop along the way. So I can know which switch So if I talk to the network person, I can say it's this MAC, and I'm talking to this IP. If it's in the same network, it will be MAC to MAC. So you have to see the ARP table, and you can start talking to network teams around that kind of process. So those kinds of things are important for when you do troubleshooting on that thing. So go a bit further. So vSAN builds on top of vSphere. It uses vCenter as a management plane, and you can only do 3 things: availability, performance, and capacity. Availability is the FTT value. You pick that when you deploy a workload domain, or you can do it manually inside native vSphere, or you can configure it automated using Power CLI commands and so on. You can also change it on VCF and add more to yourself. And there's actually a design, there's actually a skill in designing the policy for SPBM. So it's one of the things that's often forgotten about. So you have a partner come in, you have someone come in, they go next, 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 they do the deployment for you, and then they leave. And you're sitting there going, well, how many copies of the data do I need? What does this actually mean to me? What happens in maintenance? What happens if a disk fails? How do I replace a disk? What if I put the wrong disk in? Do I lose the disk group? Do I lose capacity and cache? Those kinds of questions which we'll talk about in a moment. So 2 types of topology, all flash and hybrid, 10 gig for all flash, 1 gig for hybrid minimums. These are things nowadays with 25 gig, 40 gig inside HCI chassis, it's not so much of a problem, but things to consider. Sizing the compute node is quite important. Why is vSAN so important to things like HCI and VCF? It is a requirement now for the management workload domain. You need at least 4 nodes for your VCF management domain, and it uses vSAN. So here's my replica and my witness. My witness is used for tiebreaker. So when we start predicting what happens when disk fails, we'll talk about the witness. And Stripe is increasing the number of disks that we can write to at the same time. And we'll talk about that in a moment as well. So from a holistical point of view, we have 3 different options. We have vSAN enterprise deployment, 3 host minimum. That's the minimum. We'll talk about maintenance a bit later on. And there's a really good article by Duncan Epping, which talks about what's the minimum number of nodes that you would have for vSAN. And I would encourage you to reread that when you start looking at VCF, because these principles still hold true. If you have 3 hosts and you lose 1, you have data accessible. You don't have data inaccessible, but if you have a subsequent failure, your data is inaccessible. You don't have data loss unless you can't bring in another host. If you bring in another host, turn it on, it will then create the fact you can bring it back. So knowing the disaster recovery, knowing the difference between data inaccessibility and data corruption and data loss are very key to understanding HCI. And we'll talk about them in a moment as we go through the maintenance piece. Okay, so we've got 3 node, we've got 2 node robo, and we've got stretch cluster. Different types of scenarios, different types of licensing, and different types of methods. But the whole concept of vSAN, and it's easy to use, provides consistency, which is our key thing, and then we can do it and scale as we need both compute and storage at the same time. So what is VVD and what does VVD bring into here? So from a VVD point of view, it takes all the design decisions that I've spoken about for vSAN and all the design decisions for NSX, vSphere, VROps, Log Insight, VRA, NSXT in the workload domain, PKS, and now as released, as mentioned, that will be released VCF with Kubernetes, with VCF4. With vSphere 7. So it combines those things together. So VVD is a way of working with VMware products and provides a quicker time to deploy the SDDC. So this is a drawing here that scares me. It's, I don't know any of these. What's the right product? What do I do with this? This looks kind of scary. It looks good. VMware's doing lots of cool things, but how do I make this work in my business? So I do this. This is how my brain works. I've got all these products I know the name of, and then someone's got to test it and say they all work together. Then I've got a list of things I'm going to have. So NSX 4 point whatever, VROps 8, vSAN, what, 6.6, 6.7, use 3, I don't know. and then all these different versions. And then how do I plan the upgrade? I want this really cool feature, but I don't want to disable this. How do I do that? So the number one thing from VVD and VCF, because VCF uses the BOM, you have a bill of materials that has been tested and is interoperable. So you know it will work. So if you just take one thing away, download the bill of materials inside VVD, and going forward inside VCF, take a look at the release notes, and it gives you the latest bill of materials that you know that VMware is actually saying will work together and can upgrade to. So it's a nice way of working in your traditional environment. Then we have an architectural design and review. We test it, and we have a prescribed way of building it. There's an Excel spreadsheet you can download that gives you all the design decisions, like a VCDX would list them out. And you can decide whether you agree with them or not. And then that's your reference architecture. But we don't stop there. We want to be able to deploy it as quick as possible. So the end result is you end up with some files, and then you can use those files to back up, recover, and deploy at scale. So the things you need to consider are, both in VVD and VCF, we have something called a workload domain and something called an architecture. So the architecture is standard, means you've got a management and a compute tier, two separate tiers. So you'll have 4 hosts in one management tier, and then you have at least 3 hosts or more in a cluster somewhere else. So you could have management, test, dev, and so on, and you've got those 3 different tiers. Consolidated is when you have management and workload together, and they build the VMs on top of it, and they sit alongside the management VMs that we all know and love. I mean, you still have them. And then Robo is a specific VVD deployment that allows you to do smaller deployments, maybe for the edge and so on. So they're the main strategy to understand. If you're doing AWS exams, such as the AWS Associate, I had to remember to say if it's an availability zone. We're very similar here. We're using very similar terminology, but it means slightly different things. So standard is management and compute, consolidated is combined, and Robo is on the edge. Then we have something that's a key thing to think about called the workload domain. So again, the workload domain is a logical deployment. People think it's a cluster. Well, it kind of is, but it's more than that. It is a logical deployment of a vCenter and compute, network, and storage together. And you have 2 different types, management and virtual infrastructure. And then inside the virtual infrastructure, we being VMware, we will give different schemes of virtual infrastructure workload domain. So for example, you can have one that has NSXT. You can have one then use containers on it. You could then use PKS. You could use something else. So anything around different flavors of product like Horizon. You don't want to build Horizon by hand. I'm just going to deploy a VI workload and automate the deployment of it, so I can have Horizon deployed very quickly. So we can have a base cluster with one vSAN data store, or we can have a flavor, which could be Horizon, PKS, and then up and coming Kubernetes, those kinds of things. So from a VVD perspective, and then I'll transition to VCF as well, guided documentation, we give you lots of checklists, we give you lots of theory on how to do it, but the most important thing is we give you the bill of materials, which here tells you these are the things that work. Yeah. Then, so I encourage you to go on there today, go onto the portal, go to the VVD documentation, and it gives you step-by-step guides on every single piece on how it works. This is VVD and 80 to 90% of VCF. It gives you an understanding for free how to deploy it and what to look at it. If you use this as a starting point, you use the BOM as a starting point and use the design decisions as a starting point, you can then download the Visio diagrams and just make the changes that reflect your platform. So your documentation is nearly done and your design is nearly done. Then you just know which things to consider that are slightly different for your use case. So we're trying to simplify the things. So for each area, we've got diagrams for each one. So we know what it looks like, we know how to build it, and we can just download one BOM as one file. So here's my file for my BOM of all the things put together. Yeah. So you can just download these actual parameters, and then we go even further than that. We allow you to be able to take these design decisions, decide, talk to your SMEs, talk to your network person, talk to your storage person, and then decide from that point what design decisions you need, and then think about the logical design, what makes it look like yours. So here's an example of a real life design that I had. They use VVD. They've got 2 management planes. They have to have 2 separate places, so they could have 2 instances of VCF. They've got different non-prod and prod, so they keep them separate. So each one of these is a workload domain, and we have different clusters within the workload domain, and then we keep a management workload domain away from it all. So we meet the security type of things. And then we add NSX Manager to store our DFW firewall rules. And all we care about, we maintain licensing by using vRealize Log Insight, and we make sure we have the right type of ready node. Okay, so we gather the information. We have something called the Excel spreadsheet or deployment parameters that we can download, both for VVD and VCF, and we fill them in. So again, you go through every single component, all the things that you would think about when you talk to your team about configuring. This is the longest part of it. You can actually, the first thing I'd do is I'd ask for a copy of this, whoever deploys it, and make sure you've got a copy of this, all the license keys, all the versions, what's in there, what's the naming, and you've got a detailed workbook at the end. I know I've never worked in a company that had this straight off. You had to write it together with someone else. So that's quite nice. So we have our VVD, and we now put VCF on top. So from a VCF point of view, we're going to deploy it quickly, and then we're going to add the common day 2 operations. So here, for my day 2, I'm going to log on, and I'm going to download a single OVA called the Cloud Builder. And I need 4 ready nodes. These 4 ready nodes are going to run ESXi. If they come pre-installed, which they normally do, and they're the right image, I can just use them and skip this phase. Or I can re-image them later and turn on the Cloud Builder and have this browser that builds my ESXi hosts, so they're standard. Then at this point, I have my Excel spreadsheet that we've been spending a couple of weeks filling in, making decisions on, making sure our design does it. We upload it to the Cloud Builder. It converts it into JSON, and then it pushes out the PSC, it pushes out the VCSA, depending on the version, and it also pushes out the NSX Manager and the vRealize Log Insight, and then another VM called the SDDC Manager. So this is the base VCF. Then you can go back into SDDC Manager, and this SDDC Manager, you can then transfer, and that's where you do your normal infrastructure as a service admin. So Cloud Builder is a single time use. And then if you want to rebuild the host, you can power it back up again. We're using the VMware imaging appliance. And then it will build out from SDDC Manager, vRealize Lifecycle Manager. And then using API calls, it will then deploy VROps and VRA, depending on the license. So that's an instance of VCF. That's the process. That's called bring up. For VVD, it will deploy Cloud Builder once. It will push out the management tier, and then you have to do everything else yourself. You can't do the day 2, and you can't do the vRealize Log Insight. Sorry, the VRLCM. But for the management workload domain in VCF, you deploy Cloud Builder, it pushes out the initial, that's called bring up, and then from the SDDC Manager, you can then do your day 2, which is what we'll talk about in a moment. So the things you consider is you prep the hosts, you have an Excel spreadsheet, you bring up the management domain, and you deploy VROps and VRA, and then you just select the right number of instances for your design. This plan deployment, you think about the guardrails, you bring it up. So I'll zoom past this because you may have seen this before. You go and bring up, this is what bring up looks like, step by step, click next, upload this file that we spoke about. It converts it, it validates it, and then it says I'm deploying it. You can restart them. You can restart the processes. You can monitor it. You can download a file that says what's changed, and it shows that you've now built it. And then you can log in to your vSphere environment, and you've just built the platform. In the reality, it takes about 4 hours to do the first one, and then about 20 minutes to 30 minutes, depending on the size of the workload domain going forward. So for ESXi host minimum, it deploys the PSCs, the vCenter appliances, the login site, NSXV currently, and then SDDC Manager. Then you can log into SDDC Manager and then deploy out VROps if you have a license, and also VRA if you have a license, depending on what you do. Okay, then this is the day 2 piece. This is what a day 2 admin would want to do. They now have to log in to SDDC Manager, make logical workload domains. So one for Windows, one for containers, one for prod, one for production systems or production Linux. So then they want to have an ESXi hosts, minimum of 3. In the latest version of VCF, you can have NFS, and you can also have fiber channel in the workload domains, not in the management domain. That has to be vSAN. And for each workload domain, you have a vCenter, and you can have NSXT or V in any of the Windows containers and so on, depending on what you're deploying out. So you need to make a decision on how many workload domains you need, how many hosts you need for each workload domain, and what the firewall rules between each workload domain are. That's the kind of mapping that you want to talk about. And then it looks like this. So it's one of our standard slides saying how you can build out different types of workload domains that are specific to the workloads that you're using, and different types of hardware compatibilities. So you could say, I'll have one with my existing fiber channel and use that out till it goes out of support, migrate to vSAN later on, get used to different workload domains for prod and test, and have different types of hardware depending on the cost. Okay, and that's the automation pieces that are going in the background. I zoomed past them quite quickly, but this is the kind of automation you have. Yeah, and there's, for every single version of VCF, it's growing quite quickly. So check the release notes, check the knowledge bases, and check what you get for each one, because each one has an impact to operations. Okay, so thoughts between it, you got your self-build, you have your vSAN ready nodes, and you have your HCI-based solution. So the number one thing when you're talking about this is you need vSAN ready nodes to make it easy. And what is a vSAN ready node? There's a really good video here, which was in 2018 by the BU at VMworld. It goes through what a vSAN ready node is. This is a tested hardware compatibility list for both vSAN and vSphere that says it will work to a certain priority and a certain workload speed and performance. So instead of saying I need X number of nodes of X, Y, and Z, HP, Dell, and so on, I just need a profile of a vSAN ready node. So I have there's all the firmware, it's validated and it's tested. What if you don't buy a ready node and you just buy the actual pieces? That's common. People have done that before in the past. They just buy the bits because they can get a better deal maybe. The VCF ready node also has a support element, and the support element are things such as the types of disks. So later on, when you've deployed it, you get some failed disks or worn out disks, and a man or a lady comes along and gives you a new disk. What's the likelihood of that being a proper vSAN ready disk? If you haven't bought ready nodes, you might not get it. Then you have a different performance. So the cache tier doesn't say yes quick enough, outstanding IO goes up, congestion comes in, and then you get problems inside your vSAN, which then impacts your performance throughout. That is itself one of the common things that I've seen in the market. People will then say, we've got all this strategy, they miss out the ready node configuration, and they buy a different type of SKU for the ready node, and they don't get this performance they need. So this is key to think about. So it removes the complexity, and you are after the right profile. So you go through the ready node sizer, you get an understanding, and you just say, I have a number of VMs, the number of IOPS, and then how much storage I need. And you have a HY2 series. I have an AF6 series, or I have a full clone AF8 series. And then going forward, what you need to know, if you need to replace disks or expand disks, they need to be at least the same performance class and at least the same endurance class. So go to your system, know what the profile name is, know what the performance class of your disk is, know what the endurance class of the disk is, and check what support happens when they fail the disk. Sounds silly, but it will save you from being woken up at night, like I was earlier on last year. Cool. To size your data stores, this is an often common thing that you see having underestimated around it. With vSAN, you have two types of storage, cache and capacity. The cache tier, each one can be up to 600 gig. That's the maximum amount of cache. That's how much yes you're going to have. Generally, the rate of change in your platform live data is a good rule and indicator. Then the capacity here, the aggregate of these three disks, so let's say they're all 1 terabyte, so we've got 3, 6, 9, 12. We've got 12 terabyte raw. The cache does not go into the capacity at all. There's no counting there. Then we say we need 70% is the maximum we want to run at, because we need 30% slack when we do the read, write, and changes of RAID trees, when we do our policies, and we do replica witness, and we change those policies and move data around. So if our VMDK can be a maximum of 255 gig objects. So if we have 512 gig logical disk, we have at least 2 objects. Another daily check is 9,000 objects per host. So the object count counts. So if you have a SQL box with 12 logical disks, each of them, as best practice says in SQL, to separate the LDFs and MDFs and then separate the logs based on the CPU count, you can have a lot of objects. Extrapolate that by number of VMs in your SQL cluster, you could potentially have lots of storage, lots of objects. Lots of objects mean lots of movement inside your cluster if you move things around. So to work out the space, 70% is the maximum you want to use. So you reduce 30% of it, and then that's your logical storage. Then the usable storage, you apply your FTT value to. So FTT of 1 is RAID 1. FTT of 2 is replica witness. So you've got 3 copies of the data, 4 copies of the data is FTT of 3. So then you can work out how much storage you've got and how much storage you've used. So again, here it shows you it's all thinly provisioned. However, that's your usable storage. And then for VCF, management workload domain requires vSAN. NFS is an option from 3.5, only in the workload domain, not the management domain. And fiber channel is also an option from 3.9. So for capacity views, 6.7U3 fixed a lot of the concerns around operational management. So for example, you can't fill up a vSAN data store now with 6.7U3. It stops the replication, but it continues the IO. So you won't fill it up. You do get RAG reports, you get a better breakdown, and you can do predictability around it to say what the objects are. So you can actually see what the objects and capacity are for each one. And then if you want to aggregate this, VOps gives you the aggregate of all of them. If you've got lots of workload domains, 1 vSAN per workload domain, for example. Any questions so far? Well, I've been talking a little while. Please put any questions in there if there's any point, but we'll carry on. From a network point of view, again, MTU, vSwitch type, NIOC design is one of the most important pieces. vSAN doesn't use NIC teaming for performance. It will have different streams, but it won't be using them for 2 at the same time for performance. So the size of your pipe being 10 gig would be the maximum session size. Again, NIOC is important. VVD will say deploy NIOC. NIOC is a way of controlling the network traffic from the VM NIC to the physical NIC. But once it leaves the physical NIC, there's not much we can do about it without putting a QoS marker. So one of the considerations is to talk to the network team and understand the QoS. So do the data path, the QoS, the MTU, and what the path between L2 to L3, and have the MAC address table. Then you can actually trace the troubleshooting. From a performance point of view, latency is number one, and then for day two, manage and review things such as outstanding IO, congestion, impact of all this. These are all default VOps dashboards and checks. Same thing for availability. Know what the workload type is. Know you need at least 4 to start, and if you have any outage during maintenance and what the impact would be. So for example, default FTT of 1, you have replica witness. If I put it into maintenance mode, by default, it marks everything as absent. Absent means it will start rebuilding after 60 minutes. So when you do your upgrade, you have to ask yourself a question. If I update the firmware, reboot the host twice, will that take more than an hour? If it does, change that rebuild, CLOM rebuild delay. If you don't change it, data will start moving. Okay, things like that. So these are the key processes to consider. Again, all this is on my elasticsky.co.uk. You can just download some checklists and extra links to talk about this, so you go into much more detail. So from a virtual machine policy, often missed, this is when you choose what the policy is. So you can say, I want at least 2 copies of the data or 3 copies of the data. Reason why it's important is if I've got here my ESXi hosts, and I have my VM here, I've got replica, witness. I put it into maintenance mode to do some work. It marks this as absent. My data is still accessible because I've got this one. But if I lose this object, I have a data outage. So some people have FTT of 2, which means I can have a subsequent failure during maintenance. So when you do your change control process, show at the point where you put maintenance mode, you have a single point of failure potential, or increase the FTT value. Either way to here. So you can export them. Another thing is inside VCF and normal vSAN, I would export these every day by default and have them configured. And then you know your platform is ready for data by doing testing. So pull out the disks, consider those things, but vSAN itself needs to have the right SCSI sense code, and the firmware sends a SCSI sense code. So make sure when you're pulling it or testing it, you're testing the firmware as well as the hardware. Way of doing that is inside every single ESXi host, there's a Python script that you can say artificially mark this object as failed, and then you can see if the hypervisor would react correctly. Then you fail a disk, and then you would see what would happen in the real world. So you can compare both. Again, I'll put a link on there for that piece. So the concept to reduce all these decisions is to review VVD, apply your logic, prepare your platform, and then deploy and operationalize. So what does a HCI or vSAN admin do? For VCF, they work with SDDC Manager, but your day-to-day works on your UI. For VCF, there's a new utility, a command line one called the SOS tool, which allows you to do automated tests, both on the vSAN and on the hosts. It allows you to decom, it allows you to put the host back in and commission them. So things such as from day one, we deploy everything out, and then we have to configure our health checks. We configure our processes, how to start them up, how to power them down, how to replace a host. What if a host fails? How to replace disks, how to expand, and so on. So this day-to-day admin changes slightly into this GUI, which is the SDDC Manager. So on here, that is my to-do list for day one. How do I power them up? How do I power them down? That's the right order. How do I back up them? If I back up the SDDC Manager, I don't get everything for DR. I need to think about NSX. I also need to think about how I get there. In 3.7 VCF and 3.9, there are different types of backup, file-based and API-based. Looking at monitoring, login sites installed, but it's got to be configured slightly. VOps dashboards got to be looked at every day, looking at alarms. So having a list of health checks, knowing how to get your log collection, how to clean up the hosts if they break, how to redo the vSAN partitions, and then how to get to the SDDC Manager using SSH is one of the key checks. So these things sound silly, but when you build them together, that's how to operationalize and function the product like you would with vSphere normally. Okay, so there's your platform. There's the platform status, that's what it looks like. These are the health checks I mentioned. So from a vSAN perspective, every single check, every 50 minutes is checked for you. It gives you a green light for each one. Firmware, disk number, build recommendation, number of objects. Is the object healthy? Is the object not healthy? So knowing where to go for each process is useful. And again, you can automate a lot of these using things like daily checks, using Power CLI. End-to-end testing, network performance, latency before and after. So that workbook with the MAC address and the IP addresses can tell you when you speak to the network person, it used to be 1.4 milliseconds. Now it's 5 milliseconds. Can you help me? And you can see the front end and back end according to the first diagram I mentioned. So does ESXi know? Make sure things are not absent or degraded. Understand what objects you can have from VOOps. From a VOOps point of view, you've got default dashboards. These default dashboards, again, I give you a link to a deep dive and go into more information here. And it shows you all the clusters aggregated. And it gives you the IOPS latency. So the latency of the cache disks, the latency of the front end, gives you the dedupe. It also gives you the balancing. It gives you the congestion. So if you look at the ops dashboard, on the ops dashboard, it gives you all the information I've been talking about from the very earlier one. So here it says what the latency before, the latency after migration, and all the different views. So it gives you the ability to see all the issues. So write latency. Is the disk being used at the front, the back? What about back pressure? Are all the disks being used? Is the buffer low? These, based on that one drawing at the beginning, you can actually work out on the data path, work out where the problem is. And it says it in plain English. Okay, so these are the considerations. What type of maintenance mode you use. In 6.7 U3, you can plan the change. So if you're using a more later version, so VCF 3.9 and then 6.7 U3, you can start predicting things. So I'm going to put this host into maintenance mode, what's going to happen. And it gives you, without doing it, what VMs are impacted, what their status will be, what the predictive health and what the space will be. So these things are available directly in the client to make it a lot more easier for you to predict, which is the first thing I said we needed to do. Same thing with lifecycle management. You download a bundle, you move the data around, you understand the risk. So look at the release notes, look at what happens. If it's a non-disk format change, or is it a disk version change? A non-disk format change can potentially mean data is evacuated. The last few updates have only been metadata changes, which means it can be done live. So those kinds of things are important when you're planning the operational. Then what happens if you can't fix it? What happens if you don't know? What happens if you can't understand what's going on? That's what GSS and our team are there for. So if you enable CEIP, we obfuscate the data. We take all the MAC addresses, the names and everything off, and we send that information to GSS. And then we have this information at the back. And then we have a support tag. This support tag here, you can give that to your TAM, you can give it to me, and we can log on at the back and see this. This is what GSS would see. And they can actually say what changes have been happening, what performance is happening, what the firmware is, what the capacity is, and what the network bundle or the log bundle. If you're concerned about this, going forward, there's a really good article that I give you a link to, which talks about what information you send to VMware, how much data you're sending, how often, and so on. And I think it was John Nicholson did a great job on it, and you can talk to your compliance officer around it. From VCF, the great piece around this is that all these processes, and it sounds like quite a lot, they can all be automated. So from VCF 3.7 onwards, there's a public API which allows you to say, as long as you've got the right number of hosts, change all the certificates, change all the passwords, and add or extend or decom a workload domain or host. So you can do new hosts, change a workload domain, expand them, or just do daily reports. So you can report back on yourself. So you can pretty much manage VCF like you would manage AWS, like you'd manage in that way if you wanted to. But you can also take the traditional way of working and look at the processes that we've spoken about here. And here's an example. This is the minimum I would need. I would want a admin share on the top left-hand corner. So all my daily checks automated using vCheck, using my vSAN dashboards. I'd export my VDS for each cluster. I'd export my vSAN policies automated. It's one line from a Power CLI cookbook, which was written by Jesse McCartney. Those kinds of things can all be stored there. Then I've got access to utilities. I've got access to utilities and I back up all my areas. So I can roll back if I make a change. I can deploy quickly if I want to expand. I can do all, and I can get help if I need to. So all these things together could be literally half a day's work to get ready for VCF. Yeah.
Hi, Paul. Thanks. Sorry to interrupt you there. Andreas has just said, where can he get the tag for support? Is this for Humbug?
It is. This is for Humbug. So it's in the vCenter, the vCenter configuration, and it is on there, obfuscation. So you can actually see it on the tag. And it gives you a vCenter support tag for it. And that unique object there, if CEIP is enabled. So to give you an example, all this here, I did this on my home lab, deployed it for 50 minutes, and then it came up on the back end, and it showed my licensing and everything 50 minutes later. So I wouldn't be able to see this in Humbug, they call it, without knowing that key. If you're a member of JSS and you log in, they would automatically have access. So it reduces the people who can see it for compliance. Yeah. So that's the ops example. There's also another question around vSphere 7 regarding vSAN. So yes, vSphere 7 was announced. So vSAN 7 was announced earlier this week, out on the 1st of May. There is a whole heap of new features. What I've got is a video, which I can give you a link to, which is what's new with vSAN on YouTube. It was done by the technical marketing team. Some of the key things that are out there are you can do storage, file system storage, for example. There's a new way of upgrading vSAN, which is quite good. So they combined it to use firmware and hardware, and all of it in one GUI to a limited number of things. So VUM is still there. VUM is still well looked at. VUM is still what you would do normally. But if you've got some of the newer kit that come out on day one, you can do that. There's more enhanced containers, more enhanced container function in there. So there's quite a few pieces around it. Yeah. Okay. So as a technical approach summary, again, if this is a one-to-many or one-to-one with you as your customer, if I was to see you as a customer, this would take a full day and go into a lot more detail with a lot more deep dives, a lot more. But the key things to take away is go and read VVD, at least get the BOM, the designs, think about every design decision and then say, does it impact you? It'll probably take you about half hour to read them. Then go to the release notes of VCF and think about VCF from a guardrail perspective and say, will this change the way I work? Then with vSAN Ready Node, consider what storage you're going to use. I'd recommend vSAN, but you can use others. And then consider how you would run the operationalizing phase. Me, we're using platforms that are infrastructure as code. So we're trying to use as minimum manual features as possible. So you can do things with a limited number of files without running code. And if you want the code, you can start doing all sorts of other things as well. Okay, If you're interested in doing a bit more, I do quite a lot of these sessions to the learning zone. So I go a bit deeper. I've done deep dives on quite a lot of this on the learning zone. So there are some official systems that's just been released. Literally, the beta has just been done, which is vCloud Foundation Manage and Operate, which goes into the day-to-day of this, which is 3 days. That's available now. The vSAN course I'd recommend. The Deploy and Manage is really good, but also the production operations is excellent as well. There's exams for the vSAN specialist, which are really cool. I've got some example questions and a step-by-step objectives checklist on my website if that's useful as well. So all the VVD mind maps, I've got a load of VVD mind maps here. So for example, I go through each of the checklists on here. I go through each of the areas you would think about. Again, which is what version, what does the SDDC Manager do? What do I connect to? What's the impact? For which version, what do I have? What a workload domain considerations are. So each one of these is a design consideration. And for each design consideration, you would have a risk. And then you would decide on the risk if you want to operationalize it. So again, you can download them. They're all available on here. This is on here. And then I've got a whole heap of links for all the official documentation, all the books, all the podcasts I'd recommend. I've gone through all the VMware videos and a load of different scripts and reference architecture that you might want to read before or if you're doing vSAN or VCF. Cool. Any questions at all? If I can help you and your customer, please reach out to the TAM. Otherwise, thank you for joining me. I think we kept nearly all the people who logged on at the beginning, so I'm really happy. You didn't all run off when I started talking, which is always good.
It was the mention of the tortoise, I think, Paul.
I think it was. It was.
Paul, thank you very much for the content today. I thought it was really great and really enjoyed your presentation, really enjoyed the whiteboarding that you do. And as we mentioned before we began the presentation, this is recorded and you can get this recording through your TAM. Just reach out to your TAM. So yeah, thanks, Paul. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you. All please join us next month when we'll be looking at VMware solutions and how we can enable remote working with Brian Madden. I don't know if you know much about Brian Madden, but he's an awesome guy, very similar to Paul. Gives fantastic presentations. So we look forward to seeing you all there on the April the 9th. And thanks very much all for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.